Not long after the seven dwarfs came home, and they were terribly frightened to see dear little Snow white lying on the ground without motion, as if she were dead. They lifted her up, and saw in a moment that her stays had been laced too tight. Quickly they cut the stay lace in two, till Snow white began to breathe a little, and after a time was restored to life. But when the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said, "That old market woman was no other than your wicked stepmother. Snow white, you must never again let anyone in while we're not with you." The wicked queen, when she returned home, after, as she thought, killing Snow white, went to her looking glass and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, am I most beautiful of all?" Then answered the mirror, "Queen, thou art not the fairest now. Snow white over the mountain's brow 1,000 times fairer is than thou." When she heard this she was so terrified that the blood rushed to her heart, for she knew that after all she had done Snow white was still alive. "I must think of something else," she said to herself, "to get rid of that odious child." Now this wicked queen had some knowledge of witchcraft, and she knew how to poison a comb so that whoever used it would fall dead. This the wicked stepmother soon got ready, and dressing herself again like an old woman, but quite different from the last, she started off to travel over the mountains to the dwarf's cottage. When Snow white heard the old cry, "Goods to sell, fine goods to sell," she looked out of the window and said, "Go away, go away, I must not let you in." "Look at this, then," said the woman; "you shall have it for your own, if you like." And she held up before the child's eyes the bright tortoiseshell comb which she had poisoned. Poor Snow white could not refuse such a present, so she opened the door and let the woman in, quite forgetting the advice of the dwarfs. After she had bought a few things, the old woman said, "Let me try this comb in your hair. It is so fine it will make it beautifully smooth and glossy." So Snow white, thinking no wrong, stood before the woman to have her hair dressed. But no sooner had the comb touched the roots of her hair than the poison took effect, and the maiden fell to the ground lifeless. "You paragon of beauty," said the wicked woman, "all has just happened as I expected." And then she went away quickly. Fortunately evening soon arrived, and the seven dwarfs returned home. When they saw Snow white lying dead on the ground they knew at once that the stepmother had been there again; but on seeing the poisoned comb in her hair they pulled it out quickly, and Snow white very soon came to herself, and related all that had passed. Again they warned her not to let anyone enter the house during their absence, and on no account to open the door; but Snow white was not clever enough to resist her clever, wicked stepmother, and she forgot to obey. The wicked queen felt sure now that she had really killed Snow white, so as soon as she returned home she went to her looking glass and inquired, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is most beautiful of all?" But the mirror replied, "Queen, thou art the fairest here, but not when Snow white is near. Over the mountain still is she, fairer 1,000 times than thee." As the looking glass thus replied, the queen trembled and quaked with rage. "Snow white shall die," cried she, "if it costs me my own life." Then she went into a lonely, forbidden chamber, where no one was allowed to come, and poisoned a beautiful apple. Outwardly it looked ripe and tempting, of a pale green, with rosy cheeks, so that it made everyone's mouth water to look at it, but whoever ate even a small piece must die. As soon as this apple was ready, the wicked queen painted her face, disguised her hair, dressed herself as a farmer's wife, and went again over the mountains to the dwarf's cottage. When she knocked at the door, Snow white stretched her head out of the window and said, "I dare not let you in; the seven dwarfs have forbidden me." "But I'm all right," said the farmer's wife. Stay, I will show you my apples. Are they not beautiful? Let me make you a present of one." "No, thank you," cried Snow white. "I dare not take it." "What!" cried the woman. "Are you afraid it is poisoned? Look here now, I will cut the apple in halves. You shall have the rosy cheeked side, and I will eat the other." The apple was so cleverly made that the red side alone was poisonous. Snow white longed so much for the beautiful fruit, as she saw the farmer's wife eat one half, that she could not any longer resist, but stretched out her hand from the window and took the poisoned half. But no sooner had she taken one mouthful than she fell on the ground dead. Then the wicked queen glanced in at the window with a horrible look in her eye, and laughed aloud as she exclaimed, "White as snow, red as blood, and black as ebony! This time the dwarfs will not be able to awake thee." And as soon as she arrived at home and asked her mirror who was the most beautiful in the land, it replied, "Fair queen, there is none in all the land so beautiful as thou." Then had her envious heart rest, at least such rest as a heart full of envy and malice ever can have. The little dwarfs, when they came home in the evening, found poor Snow white on the ground, but though they lifted her up there were no signs of breath from her mouth, and they found she was really dead. Yet they tried in every way to restore her. They tried to extract the poison from her lips, they combed her hair and washed it with wine and water, but all to no purpose. The dear child gave no signs of life, and at last they knew she was dead. Then they laid her on a bier, and the seven dwarfs seated themselves round her, and wept and mourned for 3 days. They would have buried her then, but there was no change in her appearance. Her face was as fresh, and her cheeks and lips had their usual color. Then said one, "We cannot lay this beautiful child in the dark, cold earth." So they agreed to have a coffin made entirely of glass, transparent all over, that they might watch for any signs of decay, and they wrote in letters of gold her name on the lid, and that she was the daughter of a king. The coffin was placed on the side of the mountain, and each of them watched it by turns, so that it was never left alone. And the birds of the air came near and mourned for Snow white, first the owl, then the raven, and at last the dove. Snow white lay for a long, long time in the glass coffin, but showed not the least signs of decay. It seemed as if she slept, for her skin was snow white, her cheeks rosy red, and her hair black as ebony. It happened one day that the son of a king, while riding in the forest, came by chance upon the dwarf's house and asked for a night's lodging. As he left the next morning he saw the coffin on the mountain side, with beautiful Snow white lying in it, and read what was written upon the lid in letters of gold. Then he said to the dwarfs, "Let me have this coffin, and I will give you for it whatever you ask." But the elder dwarf answered, "We would not give it thee for all the gold in the world." But the prince answered, "Let me have it as a gift then. I know not why, but my heart is drawn towards this beautiful child, and I feel I cannot live without her. If you will let me have her, she shall be treated with the greatest honor and respect as one dearly beloved." As he thus spoke, the good little dwarfs were full of sympathy for him, and gave him the coffin. Then the prince called his servants, and the coffin was placed on their shoulders, and they carried it away, followed by the king's son, who watched it carefully. Now it happened that one of them made a false step and stumbled. This shook the coffin and caused the poisoned piece of apple which Snow white had bitten to roll out of her mouth. A little while after she suddenly opened her eyes, lifted up the coffin lid, raised herself, and was alive again. "Oh, where am I?" she cried. Full of joy the king's son approached her and said, "Dear Snow white, you are safe. You are with me." Then he related to her all that had happened, and what the little dwarfs had told him about her, and said at last, "I love you better than all in the world besides. dear little Snow white, and you must come with me to my father's castle and be my wife." Then was Snow white taken out of the coffin and placed in a carriage to travel with the prince. And the king was so pleased with his son's choice that the marriage was soon after celebrated with great pomp and magnificence. Now it happened that the stepmother of Snow white was invited, among other guests, to the wedding feast. Before she left her house she stood in all her rich dress before the magic mirror to admire her own appearance, but she could not help saying, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, am I most beautiful of all?" Then, to her surprise, the mirror replied, "Fair queen, thou art the fairest here, but at the palace now the bride will prove 1,000 times more beautiful than thou." Then the wicked woman uttered a curse, and was so dreadfully alarmed that she knew not what to do. At first she declared she would not go to this wedding at all, but she felt it impossible to rest until she had seen the bride, so she determined to go. But what was her astonishment and vexation when she recognized in the young bride Snow white herself, now grown a charming young woman, and richly dressed in royal robes. Her rage and terror were so great that she stood still and could not move for some minutes. At last she went into the ballroom, but the slippers she wore were to her as iron bands full of coals of fire, in which she was obliged to dance, and so in the red glowing shoes she continued to dance till she fell dead on the floor. A sad example of envy and jealousy.